second of 3 videos on chapter 8. So in this video, we're going to talk about a lot of problems and then ways to fix some of those problems in appraisals. So there's actually really 2 common problems. The first one that our book talks about is that employees sometimes push back against performance appraisals because they don't think they're a fair representation of their effort. This is even more likely if you only have a supervisor providing feedback to the employee, because the supervisor, as I mentioned in the last video, doesn't always see everything the employee does. The other thing is, and this might happen for a lot of you, for knowledge workers, many times the supervisor doesn't actually know how to do the employee's job. So giving them feedback about how to improve their performance can be a little bit tricky when they don't actually know how to do parts of the job or can't see exactly what the employee is doing to produce the product, like a report for a client, that they have to do as part of their job. Another common problem that is mentioned in our textbook, but I've seen much more in writing about appraisal systems, and sort of why, even at the end of the chapter, they're talking about why employers are changing their systems, is that a lot of supervisors will give the same ratings to all of their employees, regardless of their employees' performance. And part of this is just the amount of work and effort that it takes to do these performance appraisals, especially if the supervisors don't have all the information they really need to do a good appraisal of the performance of all of their employees. Another thing is that if you're only doing them once a year, supervisors may not remember all of the details they really do need to give very good feedback and very detailed feedback to employees. But also, if there are rewards at all attached to the performance appraisal ratings, supervisors don't want to punish their employees, especially if there might have been factors outside of the employee's control that affected their performance that year. And so they're more likely to just give everyone very high marks. And then it makes it really difficult for leadership in the organization to use performance appraisals to identify, for example, who their top talent is or who would be good in their succession plan for moving up into leadership over their career. So let's talk about some of these common performance appraisal problems are. We've talked about bias before. In fact, we just talked about it a few chapters ago in terms of hiring. But bias and hiring, a lot of those same biases also affect performance appraisals. We also have a couple of other performance appraisal biases that we haven't learned about yet that we'll learn about in this chapter. And those are attribution error and rater error or rater errors. Let's go through those in the next few slides. So attribution means here, and when we're talking about attribution error, means what reason do you give for someone else's behavior? And there's a thing called the fundamental attribution error. And what it means is that when we see someone else behave in a certain way, especially negatively, we blame the person's character, or we think that that's a trait of that person, instead of thinking about the context or the situation in which the behavior occurred. There's a really good example in our book. So here is kind of a graphic that goes with the example in the book. Say that someone is driving just erratically or fast or cuts you off in traffic. You might yell at that driver like you're a terrible driver or you're very rude or whatever it is that you want to say to that driver while you're driving. So you're making some kind of attribution about their character or a trait about them, that they're a bad driver, for example. And it could be that this person actually cut you off or is in they're speeding because they need to get to the hospital. They're having a baby and they're trying to take their partner to the hospital and have that baby. Well, if you knew that, you probably would think differently about that person. But from the outside, you can't see that reasoning. You just see this car. And so this is something that we naturally do. We blame other people's character for the issues that they have. And then we forget about the situation or context. In the performance evaluation realm, what this means is sometimes supervisors don't consider the situations that their employees are working in that could affect their employees' performance. So, for example, perhaps an employee is working with a very demanding client, and the client keeps making demands throughout a project so that the project deliverable, which could be a report, it could be some kind of product they've made or a service they're providing for the client, is a little bit delayed. It's past the deadline. Well, the supervisor, if they are not involved in the project, may just see that this employee delivered the deliverable late, and so they'll put that into their performance evaluation information, when in fact they may not know that the situation was that the client kept asking for things and no one was really stopping the client from asking for more, and so that resulted in a late deliverable. So that would be an attribution error. You can see where that can be very negative in an evaluation, because if the attribution's for something outside the employee's control, but that's not written into their evaluation, they may actually be harmed by something bad that happened that was really not in their control. We also have a lot of different kinds of rater errors. Some of these you've seen before in terms of hiring, and they operate the same way for performance, and then some we haven't. So the halo effect we learned about in hiring, this is when there's some good characteristic about someone. Maybe they make a very good first impression, or they're very professional, or they're very articulate, or they're dressed nicely at their interview. And that makes you have a very positive perception of the person overall, even if they've made mistakes or if they say kind of have the wrong answer during an interview. The same thing can happen with employees. And I would imagine some of you have seen this before where, there's a general positive impression of an employee, and then it seems like that employee can never do any wrong. That's the halo effect. The horns effect is the complete opposite. There's some negative characteristic of this employee. It kind of sours the impression that employee has made with their supervisor or whoever's rating them, and then they get a lower rating simply because of this one characteristic that may or may not have anything to do with the rest of their performance. I'm going to save the distribution errors for the next slide, so let me go to recency effect. This is a really common problem when you have only, if you do evaluations only once or twice a year. And what this says is that the most recent information that a supervisor or whoever is doing the rating has is the information that's most likely to show up in the evaluation because it's the easiest for us to recall when we're thinking through someone's performance. And you can even think about this right now. If I asked you, what have you done this semester? Like what kinds of work have you had to do in your classes? The work that you're most likely to remember best right now is what just happened this week or even last week. But if I ask you what happened in September, you may not even remember some of the work you did in September. That's the recency effect. It happens in lots of different contexts, but it can be a problem here when we're rating employees simply on what they've just done in the last few weeks instead of what they've done over the whole year or whatever the period is that we're doing the rating on. We learned about contrast error in hiring. The same thing happens with performance evaluations. If you're evaluating the performance of employee, like say Lucy, and she does a really excellent job, and then the next employee is George, and he does an average job, he actually might get a worse rating than he would get if in another context because Lucy looked so good that George actually looks quite bad, even though he's just an average employee. And you can reverse this too. If Lucy's actually not a very good employee and you give her a terrible mark or a terrible rating, and then you go and look at George, who's an average employee, he might actually get better ratings on his evaluation because compared to Lucy, he's doing much better. So that's the contrast error. The similar to me error, we've also learned about people who are similar to their supervisors or the raters who are rating them in terms of performance are more likely to get higher marks because you can relate to those people better than employees who might be different from their supervisors or their raters. And then the idiosyncratic rater effect is that some people just generally rate people, like if they have to do performance evaluations, their standards are so high, they just rate everyone kind of low. Other people, their standards are very low, so everyone gets a very high rating. It's just the way that they see the world and how they perceive things. This is not a problem if you have the same rater for everyone. Unfortunately, most organizations are so large that you have different raters because you have different supervisors for different employees. If each supervisor has their own idiosyncratic rater effect, so that some are rating people lower, some higher, then that becomes a problem when you have to compare employees' ratings across different supervisors. So we have some ways of kind of controlling for that I'll talk about in a couple of slides. Let me really fast talk about distribution errors. Distribution errors are about the rating scores that employers or raters, supervisors, whoever's doing the rating is giving. And you can have three kinds of distribution errors. And these are a little bit what idiosyncratic rater errors look like as well. Distribution errors when we talk about strictness means that you're giving low ratings for all of the employees. Central tendency means that all employees are getting like the average rating. And then leniency means everyone's getting a high rating. This would be regardless of employees' performance. So this strictness, central tendency, or leniency is about how a rater, is rating everyone regardless of their performance. Leniency is extremely common. I would say of the three, that's the most common. And that's why a lot of organizations have found their evaluations very useless. If everyone's getting a high rating, it's hard to differentiate your really great performers from just your average employees or even worse. So how do we reduce these errors? We can do two things. First is calibration, and calibration is when supervisors fill out their evaluation forms and give kind of draft ratings for their employees. And then they all meet in a meeting together, all the people who are going to be doing ratings for their different employees. And they're going to talk about each employee and go through the information. If you're in a super large corporation, it's not going to be everyone together. You might be in small groups, but the idea here is that by having lots of different raters working together, they can help reduce the impact of idiosyncratic rater error, people not rating exactly the same way, so that you have all these distribution errors, and then everyone's kind of it's much easier to compare employees across different supervisors because everyone's talked about how to calibrate them. It's very similar to what we talked about in terms of hiring when we use panels. Panels can overcome each other's biases that they might have for different candidates, so they can get I'm not going to say more objective, but maybe a more accurate view of the different aspects of that employee and how they might contribute to the job and the organization if they were hired. Forced ranking is another way that we can do this. It's not a very popular way of fixing these errors, but essentially what you do is you have a bell curve, and then you put all of your employees on this bell curve. And then you usually there's some kind of arbitrary number that you have cutoffs for. So here we have the low 10% need coaching or are subject to termination. There's a middle 70% where people are getting kind of average ratings. And then you have your top 20%. Those are the people who get promotions and raises. Those numbers, those 10, 70, and 20 can change from organization to organization. You could have places like some tech companies, for example, that bottom 10% will be terminated. You can see how this seems, you're definitely getting differences across employees because an employee has to fit somewhere on this curve. So you can tell who are the top ones versus average versus lower. The bad thing is two things actually for employees. One, where they fall on this curve depends on how other employees are doing in their jobs. So it's not all completely in their control. The other thing, and this is what some tech companies learned after a few years of doing this, is that if you're going to terminate all the people who are at the very bottom, that's not good because you eventually theoretically will start terminating very good employees because someone has to be at the bottom. And so if all of your employees are great, someone still has to be at the bottom. And if you're going to terminate them, what a waste of money for you if that's a great employee. So this is not used very often. And I would say if it is used, it's in organizations with much more competitive cultures. And again, it could be something you can ask about in interviews if you suspect that this might be something that an organization does in terms of their evaluations. They also might talk about it if you just ask about evaluations and how they evaluate employees and what that system or process looks like. They might tell you about this if this is something they do.